Hi guys, it's Lily and I'm here with a video on how to make stamps for your bullet journal. Let's start off with some supplies. Okay, for stamp carving, you just need a couple of materials. You need a carving block, and I use this Speedball Speedy Carve, which I like because it's really soft, it's easy to carve, but it's not too crumbly. Some of them, for some reason, don't hold up very well. They get crumbly as you work with them. And then I just have this kind of standard speedball carving tool that comes with a bunch of different size tips in the base of it. And it comes with 5 different sizes. One of them is a knife though. So yeah, that's basically all you need. And then of course some ink and a pencil. So I've gone ahead and sketched out some of my designs, and you want to remember that whatever you're stamping is going to be the opposite. So if you're going to do text, you want the text to be backwards. So for this one, I wrote out my quote on tracing paper and then rubbed it onto the stamp this way. I think that's one mistake beginners make, like right off the bat, is they forget to flip what they're carving. So yeah, you can kind of just sketch right on the carving block, but sometimes, if you make a mistake, it's hard to get it off. For the most part, you can erase a little bit on these though, which is good. So yeah, let's get carving. Okay, so to get started, I'm using the biggest, broadest tip to carve with, and generally you want to use the bigger tips to get rid of the excess on the sides or any big areas you're carving, so that you're not taking forever and just kind of chipping away at it with the smaller tips. And I usually like to go around the outside of the stamp first, being careful to get those lines kind of straight as possible. Yeah, just kind of chipping away at the sides. And now I'm just going over it with my pencil to kind of see how my edges look, because I did carve out some spaces where the pencil hadn't touched. And so to get kind of a preview of what it's going to look like, I'll just put a little graphite over the top. Now I'm just carving out the middle. And you can see sometimes for me it's easier to turn the block with my left hand instead of trying to turn the tool with my right hand. So you can see that I change out the nibs a lot in this video. I just always try and use the right size for the job I'm doing. So as I'm carving out this intersection here, you can see that the edges are getting thinner, and you want to be really careful when you're carving a stamp that has thin edges anywhere. It's really easy to kind of slice right through it or make it too thin, and then it breaks later on when you're trying to stamp it. So slow going is best here. And when I get close to the end, I like to test it out with some ink just to see how it's going, if I need to refine any edges, if there's any obvious parts that are stamping in the middle there that I don't want stamped. And so this stamp was for my weekly spreads, and I wanted that top part to be darker for a header, and then the box is about the size I roughly do for my weekly box. So it's really handy for any weeks where I don't really feel like counting out the squares and, using a ruler to line with pen, and I don't know, it gives it a really kind of rustic and fun look. You can see here that I'm still, even after I've already used it and tested it, I'm still kind of refining any spots that are stamping that I don't want to. Although I do kind of like the little random lines in the middle. I think it gives it a little bit more character. And yeah, like I said in my weekly video, sometimes I just go in and fill little spots I missed with a Q-tip and the ink if it's not filling the way I want it to. So this one is a lot smaller, obviously, so there's not as much work to do on the edges. So like I did with the last one, I'm just mostly taking care of that, carving out the edges. And because it's kind of detailed and delicate, I'm using the bigger nib just for the main outside part. I'm not going in to where those are those branches? I don't know. Where the cacti arms are. I'm not cutting those out yet. So helpful when I do stuff off screen. Now I've switched to a much smaller nib. This is the smallest nib, and I'm trying to go in and get those really tight spaces on the inside. And I'm doing something here that you're not supposed to do when you carve stamps, and I wouldn't recommend, which is that you don't ever really want to point the nib right at your hand. You especially don't want to run it like right into your fingers. You can get really injured that way if you slip, which I have done before. I've kind of just gotten so used to it that I feel like I can do it now without hurting myself. But yeah, best practice is to steady the block with your hand, but don't carve towards your hand. Just, I don't know, maybe it's from painting or drawing. It just feels like such a natural thing to want to carve towards my hand, because that's where it feels steadiest. But that's just something you want to keep in mind. I don't want anyone stabbing their hand. So now on this one, I'm adding texture to the top with lines, and I'm doing this in kind of a more shallow way. I'm not going to carve, deep down in there. I'm just carving the very top layer to give that inside of the cacti texture. And when you're planning out your stamps, you want to think about the negative space and whether your whole stamp is going to be the ink or whether you just want lines. And a lot of times when you're penciling it out, it's best to color in areas that you want the ink to be in so that you don't get confused like midway through. So yeah, for these last two, the stamp is mostly in color with little details that I've carved out that will be white, whereas the first stamp was all like outline with the exception of that header area. And if you have a more complicated stamp design, sometimes it gets confusing when you're carving if you're meant to be carving out just the lines or if you're just adding detail on top. And I don't know if that makes sense, but if you look in the upper right hand corner, I had done the Succulent Jar Stamp a couple months ago, and you can see that there's areas that are filled in and I've just carved out texture on top, and then there are like rocks below it, and those have been carved out completely that are just line elements now. So in something like that, it's really helpful to color in the elements with pencil before you carve so you don't lose track. And this one I struggled because I wanted there to be spikes at the top of the stamp. And so it's really hard to get small details like that to be on their own. It's generally not a great idea just because they're more fragile, they're harder to like see what you're carving. But I think overall I got it to work eventually with this, but I don't know. I would just play around that and see where the limit is for you. But there were some stamps that I did in the beginning when I started carving that didn't work out because the elements were too hard to read or too flimsy. Maybe you'll see it better when I test stamp it. Yeah, at the top you can see that the little spikes are kind of a little wonky, and then I am trying to edit them a little bit here, which I think looks okay at the end. So this stamp I created to put the date in my weekly spread. And you could do stuff like just do a simple circle design or a square, and maybe kind of make the edges decorative so that you can letter things on top of it. The sky is really the limit with how you could use stamps in your bullet journal. So this stamp is a good example of what I was talking about earlier. The top flower part is going to be line work, where the bottom part is going to be filled. So I'm carving out that flower part on the inside, and then now I'm going around the whole outside to give the flowers their line work. Here you can see again, like I'm actually carving like right into my finger. So be careful. I kind of love the mess that gets made when I'm stamp carving. I find the pile of like shavings at the end really fun. So yeah, almost with every single stamp I make, I end up stamping it and kind of seeing what it looks like and then editing it a little bit. I think that's best practice. It's never gonna look, perfect the first go around, I think. This one I also tried to do the tiny little spikes on the outside, and it was really challenging. I would really recommend, especially when you're starting out, to start out with bigger stamps with less detail, and then work up to more complicated things as you get better. The smaller details are easier to carve into the block, like to add texture on top of the filled in area, but yeah, it's hard to get detailed stuff that's on its own. That's like a line, basically. Sometimes the rubber gets just kind of like stuck, even though you've carved it out. So you can see that I'm just sort of gently pulling little pieces that are kind of like mostly detached but aren't coming off easily. And you have to be careful with that as well, because sometimes if it's kind of loose but not all the way, you can kind of like rip your stamp a little bit. I feel like I'm just telling you all the things not to do that I'm doing, but I don't know, maybe that's helpful. I think at this point I was kind of over it, and I was just like, I'm just going all the way around the edge. I'm not doing spikes on the outside. I'm gonna make it simple. But cacti are a good stamp, easy stamp thing if you kind of go the easy route like on this one. Yeah, this is the page where I was just doing kind of a pattern with the stamps. And making stamps is really great for stamping patterns. So yeah, that was a super basic introduction to stamp carving and using them in a bullet journal. I hope that was slightly helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments below. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you again soon.